9 months. That's how long it took Pink Floyd to record The Dark Side of the Moon in 1972. 9 months of obsessive work in Abbey Road Studios. Roger Waters writing lyrics about madness, death, and time. Alan Parsons engineering sounds no one had heard before. David Gilmour playing guitar solos that would define a generation. They had no idea what they were creating. When the album was released on March 1st, 1973, it entered the charts quietly, and then it never left. 736 consecutive weeks on the Billboard 200. Over 14 years. A record that still stands today. But that success came with a cost. Roger Waters looked at the album and realized, I'll never write anything this good again. And that realization tore Pink Floyd apart. This is the story of 9 months of creation and 14 years of domination, and the curse that came with perfection. Before I share this incredible story with you, if you want to discover the real stories behind music's greatest albums, the genius, the obsession, and the price of perfection, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about an album. It's about what happens when you create something so perfect that everything else becomes impossible. In 1971, Pink Floyd was successful but not legendary. They were a progressive rock band with a devoted following in Britain and a growing reputation in America. They'd released several albums, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Metal, Atom Heart Mother, that showcased their experimental sound. But they weren't selling millions. They weren't headlining stadiums. They were respected musicians making interesting music for a niche audience. Roger Waters, the band's bassist and primary lyricist, wanted more. Not fame, necessarily, but impact. He wanted to create an album that said something meaningful. Something beyond 20-minute instrumental jams and abstract lyrics. He'd been thinking about themes: time, death, money, conflict, madness. The things that define human existence. The pressures that break people. The fears that keep us awake at night. Roger had personal reasons for these themes. His father, Eric Fletcher Waters, had been killed in World War II when Roger was just 5 months old. Roger had grown up without a father, haunted by that absence. He'd also watched Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd's original frontman and Roger's close friend, lose his mind to mental illness and drug abuse in the late 1960s. Syd had been a genius, creative, visionary, and then he'd broken. By 1972, Syd was gone, living as a recluse, unable to function. Roger had watched brilliance turn to madness, and it terrified him. These fears of death, of losing your mind, of time running out, became the foundation of The Dark Side of the Moon. In early 1972, Pink Floyd began working on the album at Abbey Road Studios in London, the same studios where the Beatles had recorded most of their catalog. Roger came in with a concept, a collection of songs exploring the pressures of modern life, the things that drive people to madness: time, money, war, death. He wanted the album to feel cohesive, like a single continuous piece of music rather than disconnected tracks. David Gilmour, the guitarist, was skeptical. Rogers always got big ideas, David said in a later interview. But this one felt different. Heavier. More personal. He was working through something. The band, Roger, David, keyboardist Rick Wright, and drummer Nick Mason, began recording. But this wasn't like their previous albums. Roger was obsessed with every detail. He wrote and rewrote lyrics. He spent hours perfecting vocal takes. He demanded that every sound, every transition, every moment served the album's concept. The engineer was Alan Parsons, a young studio wizard who'd worked on the Beatles' Abbey Road and Let It Be. Alan was just as obsessive as Roger. He experimented with tape loops, synthesizers, and sound effects no one had used before. The heartbeat that opens the album? That was Alan running a microphone through a bass drum and slowing it down. The cash register sounds and money? Recorded at a real shop. The clocks ticking in time. Alan collected dozens of clocks and recorded them simultaneously. Every sound was intentional. Every transition was meticulously crafted. The album was designed to be listened to as a whole, beginning to end, no skips. In 1972, this was revolutionary. Most rock albums were just collections of singles. But The Dark Side of the Moon was something else. It was a unified artistic statement. The recording process was grueling. 9 months. Hundreds of hours in the studio. The band was exhausted. Tensions ran high. Roger was controlling, demanding perfection. David wanted more creative input. Rick felt sidelined. Nick just tried to keep the peace. But they pushed through. Because even in the midst of the chaos, they knew they were creating something special. On March 1st, 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon was released. The album opened with Speak to Me and Breathe, a gentle invitation into the soundscape. Then came Time, with its terrifying message about wasted life and regret. Money, with its biting critique of capitalism. Us and Them, a mournful reflection on war and conflict. And finally, Brain Damage and Eclipse, Roger's meditation on madness and unity. Critics were mixed. Some praised it as a masterpiece. Others found it too ambitious, too serious. But the public responded immediately. The album entered the Billboard 200 chart in its first week. Not at number 1. It debuted at a modest position. But it started climbing. Week after week, sales increased. Radio stations played Money and Time constantly. People bought the album, and then they told their friends to buy it. By summer 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon was a phenomenon. It hit number 1 on the Billboard 200. It stayed there for weeks. Then, even when it dropped from the top spot, it didn't leave the chart. It just kept selling, kept finding new listeners, kept dominating, and it never stopped. 1973 turned into 1974. 1974 became 1975. Every single week, The Dark Side of the Moon was on the Billboard 200. No breaks, no interruptions, just an unshakable presence on the charts. It became a cultural fixture. The album you owned if you cared about music. The album your parents played at dinner parties. The album college students listened to in dorm rooms. By 1980, 7 years after its release, The Dark Side of the Moon was still on the charts. By 1985, it had been on the Billboard 200 for over 12 years. Radio stations still played it. Record stores still featured it prominently. New generations discovered it and bought it. The album had transcended time. It wasn't just a hit. It was permanent. Finally, in 1988, 15 years after its release, The Dark Side of the Moon dropped off the Billboard 200. Not because people stopped buying it, but because Billboard changed their chart methodology. The album had spent 736 consecutive weeks on the chart. That's 14 years and 24 days. It's a record that has never been broken. No album has even come close. The closest competitor is Metallica's Black Album at 580 weeks, and those weren't consecutive. The Dark Side of the Moon sold over 50 million copies worldwide. It's the third best-selling album of all time, behind only Michael Jackson's Thriller and AC/DC's Back in Black. 1 out of every 15 Americans owns a copy. It made Pink Floyd legends. It made them wealthy beyond imagination. And it destroyed them. The problem with perfection is that it becomes a prison. Roger Waters realized this almost immediately. In interviews after the album's release, Roger seemed conflicted. He was proud of what they'd created, but he was also terrified. How do we follow this? He asked in a 1974 interview. We've just made the album of our lives. Everything we do next will be compared to it, and nothing will measure up. Roger was right. Pink Floyd released Wish You Were Here in 1975. It was a brilliant album, a tribute to Syd Barrett, exploring themes of absence and loss. It sold millions, but critics and fans inevitably compared it to Dark Side. Not as good, they said. Solid, but not groundbreaking. Then came Animals in 1977. Darker, more political, inspired by George Orwell's Animal Farm. Critics praised its ambition. But again, the comparisons. Good, but it's no Dark Side. Roger became obsessed with escaping the album's shadow. He poured himself into the next project, The Wall. Released in 1979, The Wall was Roger's magnum opus, a rock opera about isolation, trauma, and mental breakdown. It was ambitious, theatrical, massive, and it succeeded. The Wall sold over 30 million copies. It spawned the hit single Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2. It became a film. It was, by any measure, a triumph. But even The Wall, as successful as it was, couldn't escape Dark Side. Critics called it Pink Floyd's second-best album. Fans debated which was better, and Roger knew the truth. The Wall was his response to Dark Side, his attempt to prove he could do it again. But proving something means you're still trapped by what came before. By the early 1980s, Roger Waters was burned out. He felt like he'd been carrying Pink Floyd for years, writing the concepts, driving the creative vision, and he resented it. He resented that David Gilmour got equal credit. He resented that Nick Mason and Rick Wright were along for the ride. Most of all, he resented that no matter what he did, He'd always be the guy who wrote Dark Side of the Moon. In 1985, Roger quit Pink Floyd. He announced he was leaving to pursue a solo career. He also announced that Pink Floyd, as far as he was concerned, was over. "Without me, there is no Pink Floyd," he said. The band had become too much. The pressure to recreate the magic, the impossible comparisons, the shadow of an album recorded 13 years earlier. Roger couldn't take it anymore. But David Gilmour and Nick Mason had other ideas. They decided to continue Pink Floyd without Roger. Roger was furious. He sued them, arguing that he was Pink Floyd, the creative heart, the lyricist, the visionary. The courts disagreed. In 1987, they ruled that Pink Floyd belonged to all the members, not just Roger. David and Nick had the right to use the name. In 1987, Pink Floyd, now just David, Nick, and Rick Wright, released A Momentary Lapse of Reason. It was their first album without Roger. Critics were harsh, calling it Pink Floyd Light. But fans loved it. The album sold millions. The tour was the highest-grossing rock tour of the year. Pink Floyd proved they could succeed without Roger Waters. Roger, meanwhile, released his solo albums. They were critically acclaimed, but commercially modest. His biggest solo work, The Wall Live Tour, was a spectacle. But it wasn't Pink Floyd, and fans knew it. The irony was complete. Roger had left Pink Floyd because he couldn't escape the shadow of the Dark Side of the Moon. But leaving didn't free him. It just meant he had to watch David and Nick continue without him, still touring on the legacy of an album Roger had written. In 1994, something unexpected happened. Pink Floyd, without Roger, released The Division Bell. It debuted at number 1. It sold 12 million copies. It proved that Pink Floyd could still create successful music in the 1990s. But even The Division Bell was compared to Dark Side. Good, but not as groundbreaking. That same year, Pink Floyd was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Roger attended. He stood on stage with David, Nick, and Rick for the first time in 9 years. They posed for photos, smiled for cameras, but they didn't perform together. The wounds were still too fresh. It wasn't until 2005, 20 years after Roger left, that Pink Floyd reunited for a single performance at Live Aid in London. They played Breathe, Money, Wish You Were Here, and Comfortably Numb. 2 billion people watched. It was magical, but it was also the last time. After Live Aid, the band members went their separate ways. Rick Wright died in 2008. Pink Floyd was truly over. Roger Waters has spent the last 40 years touring, performing The Wall and other Pink Floyd classics. He's made peace with his legacy. In recent interviews, he's been more reflective about The Dark Side of the Moon. "It defined me," he said in 2018. "For better or worse, that album is what I'll be remembered for. I spent years resenting it. But now I'm grateful. We created something timeless." How many people can say that? David Gilmour has been similarly reflective. "Roger was right about one thing," David said in a 2015 interview. "We never topped Dark Side. But that doesn't mean everything after was a failure. We made great music. We had incredible experiences. The shadow of that album was heavy, but it was also proof that we'd achieved something extraordinary." Today, 50 years after its release, The Dark Side of the Moon is still selling. It's been certified 15x platinum in the United States. It's been re-released in multiple formats: CD, vinyl, digital, remastered editions. New generations continue to discover it. Music students study it in college courses. It's been named one of the greatest albums of all time by every major publication. The 736-week record still stands. No album has come close. Taylor Swift, Drake, Adele, none of them have achieved what Pink Floyd did in 1973. Because The Dark Side of the Moon wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural phenomenon that refused to fade. It became part of the fabric of music history. But the legacy is complicated. Yes, the album made Pink Floyd immortal, but it also tore them apart. Roger Waters left the band because he couldn't escape its shadow. David Gilmour spent decades proving he was more than just the guitarist on Dark Side. Rick Wright and Nick Mason became footnotes in their own story. And Syd Barrett, the original creative force behind Pink Floyd, never got to see the success he'd helped build, having lost his mind years before. The album that was supposed to be about the pressures of modern life, time, death, madness, money, ended up embodying those pressures. Pink Floyd created a masterpiece, and that masterpiece became the weight they carried for the rest of their lives. In the end, The Dark Side of the Moon is a paradox. It's proof that humans can create perfect art, But it's also proof that perfection comes with a cost. Roger Waters was right when he said, "We'll never write anything this good again." He wasn't being pessimistic. He was being honest. Because once you've climbed the highest mountain, every other peak looks smaller. Once you've written the perfect album, everything else is a sequel. 9 months of creation, 736 weeks on the charts, 50 million copies sold, and a band that never fully recovered from the weight of their own genius. That's the legacy of The Dark Side of the Moon. Not just an album, but a testament to what humans can achieve when they're willing to sacrifice everything for art. And a reminder that sometimes the greatest success is also the heaviest burden. Pink Floyd gave the world perfection. And perfection, it turns out, is a prison no one can escape.